Gosh, almost a year ago, I was going down to Hopkinsville and I thought I'll take the long, beautiful way. So I went towards Bowling Green and came over on Highway 68. I'd made arrangements with Tommy Hines to stop by South Union because even though I'd grown up 70 miles away from it, not even that far, really, 40, 45 miles. I'd never stopped there and explored. It's magnificent. It is utterly magnificent. How many of you have been to South Union? Okay. It's, you know what I'm talking about then. And for those of you who haven't, it is a slice of beauty and history and culture, smack dab in the middle of Southern Kentucky. And it's worth a trip. It's worth a day trip. Tommy Hines is a graduate of Western Kentucky University with an undergraduate degree in music theory and folk studies and a Master of Arts degree in historic preservation. And he spent his career, his entire career, as executive director of South Union Shaker Village. He has presented on topics related to Southern decorative arts at venues that include the Frist Center for the Arts, Colonial Williamsburg, the Decorative Arts Trust, and for MESDA, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, headquartered in Winston-Salem. Hines has also authored 3 award-winning exhibit catalogs, published articles in Antiques Review and the magazine Antiques, and contributed to other publications, including Kentucky by Design, The Decorative Arts in American Culture, 2015, and Making Time, The Art of the Kentucky Tall Case Clock, 1790 to 1850, which was published in 2019. Hines received the Ida Lee Willis Service to Preservation Award from the Kentucky Heritage Council in 2001, the Edith Bingham Excellence in Preservation Education Award from Preservation Kentucky in 2018, and the Frank R. Levstik Award for Professional Service from the Kentucky Historical Society in 2020. Get ready for what will be an amazing presentation. Tommy, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here tonight. What a nice place to get to speak. And it's always fun to talk about the Kentucky Shakers. And I hope you'll hear something maybe new tonight. If you know about Pleasant Hill, which I'm sure most of you do, South Union, the Shakers down there were contemporary with the Pleasant Hill Shakers, and not as much is left there. And you'll find out a little bit more about that as we go along. When the Shakers are mentioned, it's almost inevitable that the conversation leads, if not to celibacy, to material culture. For America's most successful and long-lived communal experiment to be reduced to only these aspects of their experience is a misrepresentation of a movement that significantly influenced our nation's economy, offered respite for hundreds upon hundreds of people in need, advocated for gender and racial equality, and made it their mission to promote godly living. It all began when a handful of early converts came to America in 1774 from England, following a charismatic leader, Anne Lee, who was certain that heaven on earth was possible if all focus was on God. The Shaker lifestyle was a paradox of bold restriction and revolutionary freedom. To belong to the sect, you had to give up your property for the communal cause, be willing to confess your sins openly, and vow to live a celibate life. All the while, the Shakers saw men and women as equals, bestowing governing power to both sexes. The Shakers believed in racial equality and offered a lifestyle that was unavailable to people of color elsewhere. They established living environments that were clean, efficient, modern for their day. Technology was embraced, easing the drudgery of work. Trades were taught, education was provided, and 3 hot meals were served every day in the large communal dining rooms. Because the ultimate goal was to grow closer to God, marriage was considered a hindrance to the process. Shakers knew that not everyone was up to the task, but they sought those who were willing to try. A person's relationship to God was enhanced through work, as daily tasks were seen as opportunities for worship. So on January 1st, 1805, Shaker missionaries came to the West, traveling on foot from Mount Lebanon, New York, New Lebanon in those days, to the seat, which was the seat of Shaker leadership. Because of their efforts, eventually established for 4 villages in Ohio, 1 in Indiana Territory, and 2 here in Kentucky. The same rules applied. However, what they began to experience was an onslaught of regional customs and traditions, unlike what was familiar to them in the Northeast. A cultural conflict between the villages in New York and New England and those here in Kentucky was ever present for most of Shaker history. Both Pleasant Hill, founded in 1805 near Harrodsburg, and South Union, founded in 1807 near Bowling Green, were inhabited by converts from the Upper South, the Southern backcountry. Pleasant Hills primarily from Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina. South Union's from Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Both villages were assigned elders and eldresses from the Northeast, strongly grounded in the faith, who would oversee tremendous growth here in the state, growth in membership, in commerce, in building construction, and in land acquisition. By the mid-1830s, these leaders would be replaced by homegrown Kentucky leadership. The cultural divide between the Kentucky Shakers and their counterparts in the Northeast was vast, permeating most every aspect of their lives. Southerners talked differently, worked differently, ate differently, made furniture differently, and created living environments steeped in regional tradition. Let's begin with Shaker habitations, the most basic of needs. When both Kentucky Shaker villages were founded, the first members gathered in homes of early converts and then eventually built log cabins to support their ever-growing communities, this one being at Pleasant Hill. The use of log construction on the Kentucky frontier fascinated the Northern Shakers, who had long put that behind them. As late as the 18-teens, Shaker visitors to South Union from New Hampshire photographed the remnants of old relics that were still standing, and that's from their 1916 photo album. The first permanent dwellings at South Union and Pleasant Hill were simple 3-bay, 2.5-story structures. Pleasant Hills, as you see here, built of limestone from the nearby Palisades of the Kentucky River. South Union's built of frame with clapboard siding. Both of these early structures had detached log kitchens, which was common in the South. But about 3 years later, Pleasant Hill embarked on an ambitious construction project to erect a larger dwelling for the Center family. This was the first of the Kentucky dwelling houses to be built in a T-plan. South Union would follow suit, adopting what would become a standard dwelling house form in Kentucky. These federal-style structures were the most prominent in the villages, especially these Center family dwellings. The T-plan was reminiscent of private homes and public buildings in Kentucky, except for the fact that the L, the part coming off the back, it was centered on Shaker architecture. It would never have been centered like that in a private dwelling, because you had to have ventilation through that front hallway. The centered L allowed for more room for communal spaces, though, like meeting rooms, dining rooms, and kitchens. And it also afforded symmetry that provided architectural equality for men and women living inside. These dwelling houses were in complete contrast to what the Shakers were building in the Northeast. Their buildings were constructed in large rectangular shapes, design sensibilities entirely different than their Kentucky counterparts. Clay Lancaster thought that the Eastern Shaker settlements resembled factory towns and lacked the grace of the Kentucky Shaker villages. According to Lancaster, the T-plan of Shaker's village of Pleasant Hill's first large dwelling was a Kentucky design, sent to Mount Lebanon for review, and the plan came back and the Shakers had made some alterations to it. They added an extra story looking to the future. They had all the porches removed that the Kentuckians had added because porches were for leisure. The Shakers really weren't into leisure. And then the placement of the kitchen was put inside of the building for the first time instead of separate kitchens like were more common here. This building, by the way, was the second of Pleasant Hill's center family dwellings, and it burned in the 1930s. The Kentucky Shakers, with their Southern architectural customs, created built environments that were unique in the Shaker world. The Georgian and federal styles, which they adopted at the beginning, continued through the 19th century. When South Union built a new East House in 1847, it mimicked the dwellings that had been built 25 years earlier, with no vestige of the Greek revival craze that was really going on in the country at the time. 7 years later, South Union Shakers completed the largest workshop structure ever built in the Shaker West. The 1854 Sister Shop and Wash House was not only ambitious, but overly extravagant, built at a time that there was lots of money to be spent. Clay Lancaster believed that this building did not have a Southern look, and as he said, this design belongs more to the Eastern communities. He likened South Union's wash house to a tenement. You kind of see it, 3 front doors with when the Shakers at South Union constructed a hotel for railroad travelers in 1869, they designed a building that was an Italianate style, more up to date than the Georgian and federal design. So, and it's the only Italianate hotel ever built in a Shaker village, I can guarantee you that. The first few members of the Shaker Church came to America without a material culture created from their belief system. And it wasn't until they began to establish villages and to form objects for daily use that what we know as Shaker style came into existence. Shaker leadership in New York dictated strict rules for just about everything to be created by Shaker hands. Interpretation of those rules was inevitable, but the close proximity of those 12 villages in the Northeast ensured that liberties outside the bounds of convention seldom took place. The Holy Law of Zion in 1843 said, "Whatever is fashioned, let it be plain and simple, and of good and substantial quality, which becomes your calling and profession, unembellished by any superfluities, which add nothing to its goodness or durability. Labor until you bring your spirits to feel satisfied and thankful for that degree of modest plainness in all that you possess." The millennial laws of 1821 clearly says beadings, moldings, and cornices, which are merely for fancy, may not be made by the believers. When closely examining the furniture made at Pleasant Hill and South Union, it is obvious that beadings, moldings, and cornices, and let's add leg turnings to that, are the very features that help us to identify Kentucky Shaker craftsmanship. Simplicity was just interpreted differently here. The contrast in design and style, and often even in form, is unmistakable. There is contrast even between Pleasant Hill and South Union, owing in part to the influences of the immediate region in which those villages were located and the history of the experience of the men working in the carpenter shops. We have to remember that most all of these men that were working in these shops were adults, and they had learned their trade previous to joining the Shakers. So they were bringing in their ways of doing things and not always as influenced maybe as they should have been by the Shaker rule book. So you see at Pleasant Hill, a very strict interpretation of a square leg that makes a transition to a round leg. South Union, a little something extra there that you find on almost every Shaker table. The Shaker furniture made in Kentucky followed traditional, well-established forms, and that happened during the greatest time of production of Shaker furniture in Kentucky, 1820 to 1860. Bureaus here were constructed on turn legs, as were tables, as were desks. Tripod stands look more like regional examples than the Northeastern prototypes that you would find in New York. You see the vast difference. South Union craftsmen always seem to add subtle touches of unnecessary ornamentation, even in details as small as a chair finial. Look at the difference in the treatment the turners at Pleasant Hill made on their finials, and then those who turned the finials at South Union. A lot of unnecessary work there. But that's what makes South Union furniture unique as well. By the mid-19th century, Pleasant Hill furniture makers seemed to dial it back, following a return to simplicity by the example of the Northeastern Shakers. The South Union Shakers did not conform, creating some of the most exuberant furniture ever made within a Shaker village. These tables and these beds were created at South Union in the 1850s and the 1860s, and you could not have gotten away with that in the Northeast. The cultural divide between the Kentucky Shakers and the Northeastern villages is nowhere more apparent than in their foodways. As we are aware, the Southern diet by the early 19th century had been heavily influenced by the customs and traditions of the enslaved. Much of what they ate was also dictated by climate and the ever-present problem of food preservation. To put it simply, they ate like Southerners at South Union and Pleasant Hill. While there are only a handful of excellent manuscript recipes from Pleasant Hill, none attributed to South Union exist, which is not that unusual really, since most of those recipes were kept in the minds of those cooks in those days. Menus and manuscript references to food do exist, however, and clearly point to a Southern diet. There was always an abundance of butter and cheese and milk. Corn and wheat were cultivated for bread. The Shakers had vast orchards and gardens providing fresh and home-canned fruits and vegetables. In the early days at South Union, strawberries were gathered wild in the barrens. Now, South Union was located in a part of Kentucky called the Barrens, and there was really not much timber there, only grass. The strawberries were so abundant on the prairie that the legs of the horses walking through the barrens would often be red up to their first joint. Pork was a mainstay because of tradition, because it could be produced economically, and because it could be preserved successfully. At South Union, 14,000 pounds of pork consumed in 1821, 18,000 pounds in 1823, 22,000 pounds in 1834. The journal writer added, at Pleasant Hill, they reported 34,000 pounds of pork raised in 1830. Finally, in 1842, Mount Lebanon in New York advised the Shaker communities all over America to give up pork because they thought it was unhealthy. This was a difficult thing to do in Kentucky. Pleasant Hill noted they gave up pork in part, but it took South Union another 7 years to finally stop eating it. Thankfully, the ban was lifted in 1856. Travelers' accounts from visitors to Pleasant Hill and South Union are nearly universal in their praise for the food they were being served in these trustees' offices. A visitor to Pleasant Hill in the 19th century left what would have been equivalent of a Google review in saying that in the art of cookery, their kitchen class excel any people with whom I have been acquainted. A journalist from Cincinnati wrote, "More glorious cookery I have never met with." South Union had a similar reputation. The day was an ideal one. As we entered the quaint, quiet old town, our thoughts were that a pleasant, restful day was in store for us. It will always be a sweet memory to revert to the appetizing dinner, supper, and breakfast served during the visit. Then the spotless white bedding soothes you to a sweet and gentle slumber. Now that's a 5-star review right there. During the Civil War, the feeding of the troops was a never-ending burden for the Shakers, almost crippling them financially, and truly, from an economic standpoint, probably the beginning of the end of the Shakers. They thronged our kitchens, our kitchen doors and windows, begging for bread like hungry wolves. We nearly emptied our kitchens of their contents, and they tore the loaves and pies into fragments and devoured them as eagerly as if they were starving. The brethren and sisters were almost worn out with fatigue in their watchings and attentions to these pitiful objects. The Southern pickets rode up about 7 o'clock at night and called for supper to be prepared for 400 soldiers. We were to have it ready by 8 o'clock. We told them we were unable to cook for so many in so short a time. Then they reduced the number to 125. The sisters at the center, office, and north all set with a purpose to accommodate that number. After working hard and getting the victuals cooked, they did not arrive at the appointed time, but about midnight with 500 cavalry all expecting supper. They appeared very hungry and tired, and we accommodated as many as we could. While regional visitors seemed quite satisfied, it was a different story when Shakers from the Northeast dined with the Kentucky Shakers. Here's where you clearly see a divide in custom and tradition. On Elder Henry Blenn's visit to Kentucky in 1872, he recorded his noon meal at South Union on June 10th. We have the visitors table, and the fare was as is usual in such cases. As we had heard of Southern tables, we were not surprised at any presentation. Our dinner consisted of fried chicken, fried dried beef, potatoes, boiled rice, fine flour bread, corn cake, hot fine flour cakes, which must be exchanged for others still hotter while the company are at the table, sweet cake, dried peach turnovers, custard pie, pear preserves, strawberries, fresh canned peaches, dried peach sauce, butter, cheese, coffee, tea, milk, and wine. On another occasion, Blenn recorded what he was served for breakfast. At South Union breakfast, fried chicken, fried dried beef, boiled eggs, asparagus, graham gems, fine flour bread, sweet cake, crackers, tea, milk, sugar, butter, cheese, and strawberries. All that for a Northerner's breakfast. Then he goes on, oh dear, it would require a stomach made of cast iron to endure all the indigestible compounds that active-minded cooks are led to invent. In many places, the food is very rich, and some articles are made to swim in melted butter. Many of these varieties are about as indigestible as shingle nails. And he adds, the strawberries are delicious. At Pleasant Hill, Blenn was equally unimpressed when he was served catfish for the first time. He said, the Kentuckians think their meat is very nice for the table, but for us, there was too much fat or blubber. Eldris Prudence Morrell, visiting the Kentucky Shakers from Mount Lebanon in 1847, praised what she found at the tables at South Union Pleasant Hill. However, her impression of the food served to her while traveling through the state of Kentucky was quite different. We cannot get anything to eat but what is cooked by people that look as dirty and greasy as an old saddlecloth, and a great deal of their victuals taste more like soap grease than anything fit for humans to eat. This is the days before Duncan Hines, obviously. Eldris Prudence actually had suffered greatly on her long journey from New York to Kentucky, especially on the last leg by carriage. This is very unappetizing. We arrived safe at South Union at 5 o'clock, 333 miles from Union Village. We were nearly covered, as it were, from head to feet with ticks and jiggers. She means chiggers. The sisters were very kind. They fixed a large tub of water and we bathed well, but all that did not prevent their rage. We washed off the ticks, but their hands were so pressed into the skin that some of them had to be got out with tweezers. She goes on. The jiggers were not bigger than the point of a pin. They were much worse than the ticks, and between these two savage vermin, we had little whole skin left on our bodies. So to that we say, Americans consumed alcohol in great quantities during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Shaker villages were no exceptions. The use of hard cider as a motivator to accomplish work was common in both the Northeast and in the Shaker West. Many Shaker villages made wine, marketing and consuming it during the early 19th century. South Union went the extra mile, and in 1821 constructed a still house for the production of whiskey, just like good Kentuckians do. The first results were ready within 3 weeks, which that means it's not bourbon. and the whiskey was quickly listed as one of the many items that the South Union peddlers were taking to Nashville and beyond. Whiskey production did not go over well with the leadership at Mount Lebanon, New York, and South Union even began to see problems within the community. In October of 1827, the men in the village were called together and admonished for several infractions, including the impropriety of trying to hold private property, claiming horses as their own, and buying, hiding, and drinking whiskey out of order. 9 weeks later, the entire community was summoned to the meeting house to bring attention to the pernicious consequences arising from the least indulgence beyond downright necessity of drinking whiskey and other ardent spirits. Mount Lebanon finally said the still house had to come down, and South Union obliged. As soon as the still house was down, 2 months later, hard cider production experienced a marked increase. The loss of whiskey was a blow to the South Union Shakers, as its presence in the workplace seemed a natural expression of a very familiar custom. It appears that the Shakers' most southern outpost at South Union was the only village to produce whiskey. South Union was also the only Shaker village to have a slab or a hunt board in their dining room built in the carpenter's shop, a true Southern form. The slab was used to store liquor bottles upright in deep drawers. In Shaker villages, trustees' offices were the hubs of hospitality, offering overnight accommodations and meals and opportunities for business transactions. They were located in the center of the villages, purposefully visible and accessible to the principal highway, which at South Union and Pleasant Hill was US 68 eventually. Many of the esteemed guests from the northeastern Shaker villages were housed in the best rooms of the trustees' offices, these rooms that fronted the street. Here they often experienced regional traditions, attempts at hospitality that they were not accustomed to. At South Union, the Shakers constructed a freestanding, what they called a piazza, behind the trustee's office. When Isaac Newton Youngs arrived from New York in 1834 to draw maps of the western villages, as you can see, he included that piazza along with a fish-shaped weather vane. He says, after supper, we sat 8 or 10 of us in the piazza in a delightful situation and conversed on various subjects. We took much satisfaction in that place. Now, the concept of porches had long been looked upon by the Shakers as frivolous, but this slow pace after dinner leisurely time on the piazza at South Union seemed to please Youngs very much. After the Civil War, South Union's trustee's office was ornamented with pride of peafowl that paraded around the yard within the picket fence surrounding the building. Peacocks were still rare in America at the time, but the community decided to purchase the birds not only for decoration, but to control insects and to act as watchdogs for the office. During Henry Blenn's visit in 1873, he wrote admiringly, "This is the land of peacocks. 12 of these beautiful birds are walking around the dooryard." The next morning, our peacocks are now horrid screamers, and several times during the night, we were awakened out of a sound sleep. The next morning, the peacocks are screaming and screaming and screaming. A crow makes a more delightful noise when compared to this awful yell. The peacocks had another purpose. When Blenn arrived at the dinner table 2 days later, he observed a new feature is presented here. A sister stood by the table with a long peacock feather fan and kept all the flies from the food. It was a care for the comfort of the guests that Northerners would let pass by and leave you to manage the flies as you choose. During Henry Blenn's visit to South Union, he did complain about the lack of sleep, but it wasn't just because of the peacocks, but he complained about the train being so close to the back of the office at South Union and the noise that the other guests were making in the building. His waking hours were often interrupted too, with Elder Harvey Eades's attempt at making him feel welcome by constantly bringing him blooms from the magnolia tree. Glenn had not seen a magnolia tree before, and once Eads found out about that, he wanted to make sure he had fresh blooms as often as possible. Eads, also being a tailor, apparently irritated Glenn, constantly trying to measure him for a new suit. During Isaac Newton Young's visit to Pleasant Hill in 1834, he discovered for the first time watermelon, which he recorded were devoured without much delay or remorse. A few days later, he writes that he was once again enjoying a good feast of watermelons. On another day, he was gathering watermelons on the ground, ready to devour. 2 days later, after dinner, we had a good feast of watermelons. The next morning after breakfast, Youngs wrote that he was hindered in attending to watermelons, a duty which was difficult to get by. And finally, the following day, he was once again entangled with a mess of watermelons. So Youngs must have had quite a strong constitution. Sometimes preconceived notions about a place are made prior to even experiencing it. Even the Shakers formed stereotypes and misconceptions about the South. When Elder Giles Avery came from New York to visit Kentucky in 1862, he kept a detailed account of his journey. He rightly so abhorred the practice of slavery in the South and wrote, "One born and brought up in the eastern states can scarcely imagine the feelings of a northern man on going south into a slave state unless he has once tried it." While he was generally complimentary of the Kentucky Shaker villages, he had a terrible impression of the rest of the state. Now, he praised Cincinnati, which he said was a romantic city, a noble city worthy of the noble river and the noble state that it was located. Louisville, on the other hand, was given a very negative review. We arrived at the depot, which was filthy, and everything looked like the land of slavery in very deed. One could already see its blight manifest on everything and almost on everybody. Louisville looks like a cursed city, dirty and deserted. There is nothing of that lively, business-like movement characteristic of cities in the North and East, but all acts as though someone ought to come blow their noses for them, clean their boots, sweep their floors, and mend their broken chairs. There's more. Instead of a neat carpeted saloon at the depot, and I think he probably means salon, a dirty black room, broken chairs, and everything uncomfortable. And on the whole route, no good buildings to be seen on a single plantation, but the habitations for the white man are squalid and mean, and those for the black man unfit for an Eastern corn crib. Now, that's quite an assessment for a mere 2 hours in Louisville. So, was Avery correct? Louisville was the 10th largest city in America at the time of his visit, population nearing 70,000. And he was either not aware or just didn't mention that it was occupied by 80,000 federal troops at the time, placed there under the threat that the city would be invaded by Confederates. Louisville is also a staging area for the Union supplies and troops heading south. So the city was really not operating under normal circumstances, and the population had more than doubled. So when I first discovered this manuscript, this was several years ago, I called Sam Thomas. And I said, "Mr. Thomas, would it have been this way? Would Louisville have actually been as bad as Avery is making it?" And he said it would have been impossible for Avery not to notice some of Louisville's grand structures on his carriage ride from the boat landing to the depot. Giles Avery's impression of the depot itself, he said, though, may have been accurate. Even though the building was less than 5 years old, the dramatic increase in rail travel as a result of the war may have left it dirty and unkept. The notion of stereotype and the practice of preconception is age-old. While Giles Avery certainly saw the things that he mentions, he includes little context in his journal about the difficult situation in Kentucky. He appears to have made up his mind about the state before crossing the Ohio River. The same holds true 3 decades later in 1889 when Eldridge Harriet Bullard and others make a trip to Kentucky. As she crossed the Ohio River by train, she noted, "We are among the corn crackers." No need of being informed that such is the fact, we know by appearances. She, like the other northern visitors, observed the inhabitants of Kentucky moved at a slower pace than those with which she was familiar. The push isn't in them that's in the Yankee, she wrote. Ironically, Eldris Anna White, who was also on the same trip with her, wrote that exact same quote in a letter back to Mount Lebanon. So I have a feeling they were talking about that in one of their hotel rooms. Now, regional differences in the United States still exist today, but in many ways were so much more distinct in the 19th century. The sheer distance between the Kentucky Shakers and their counterparts in New York and New England made it possible not only to excel, but to languish in the strong regional material culture traditions of the Upper South. What many scholars and researchers eschewed for many years, the buildings and furniture that seemingly did not fit into the tight Eastern parameters, are finally being looked upon as unique and important contributions to Shaker craftsmanship. As a Southerner, I definitely understand the Kentucky Shakers' decision-making process. In fact, I relish in the idiosyncratic nature of South Union's furniture and architectural details. Beauty has always been in the eye of the beholder, and it appears that sometimes even the Shakers had a difficult time remembering that. So what happened to the Kentucky Shakers? You're undoubtedly aware of the history of Pleasant Hill closing in 1910, and then its gorgeous restoration, actual resurrection as one of the nation's preeminent historic sites beginning in the 1960s. South Union's dissolution came in 1922 and was crowned by an auction that drew over 4,000 people, an event where everything from livestock to farm equipment to Shaker furniture was sold. The 4,000 remaining acres were divided into 50 farms, and one man bought the large tract that included all of the original buildings. He destroyed all but 9 of those buildings, but thankfully, there's evidence of that. But thankfully, those 9 buildings make up our historic site today, South Union Shaker Village. And let's not forget, there is an active Shaker community in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, and that small group of people still holds to the same tenets as their predecessors across almost 250 years. So you can't say the Shaker experiment was not a success. It's not about baskets, it's not about chairs or oval boxes or round barns, but in doing good, treating others with compassion and dignity, and making every task, every day, an opportunity to worship. And by the way, the Shakers at Sabbath Day Lake, those northern Shakers, get along with the Kentucky Shaker villages just fine today. So, thank you very much. Yeah.
We have time for questions. And if you have one, feel free to come up to this mic. Or Scott, do we have a traveling mic? All right, so you either use this mic or that one. There is a question that came in through the chat room, and this is from Dennis Jennings. What was the average age of a person when joining the Shakers? He says, I assume that most were born into the communities.
Not hardly any born into the communities. In fact, I would say the average age, especially at the beginning, was 35 years of age. In the early days at both South Union and Pleasant Hill, entire families joined the Shakers, which I know is hard for us to understand today, because once you come into the community, you have to separate. The mother and the father have to separate. The children are brought up in a separate building altogether. As time went on, the demographic changes dramatically, and you see almost exclusively single parents coming into the Shaker villages with housefuls of children. A perfect place for women, especially in the 19th century, who had children without a husband on the frontier. You would have an almost impossible task of making it on your own. So the Shakers offered great spots for those people. As time went on, the demographic changed again, and your average age probably would have been 60 and 70. And most of the Shakers were aged by the time the communities closed.
What made the Shaker villages in Kentucky decline and then fall?
Well, everybody likes to say it was celibacy, but it really was not celibacy. It was a lack of interest, a lack of commitment, a change in our world. In the first half of the 19th century, I know at South Union for sure, there were people that never left their farm. They never left their home. They were dependent upon community, whether you're talking about a Shaker community or your other worldly community. When the railroad came through South Union, for instance, in 1860, you could be in Louisville in 4 hours. You could be in Nashville in 3 hours, and you could start life on your own. So you were no longer dependent upon your community. You could start life as a person, as a single person. So that made a lot of difference. And it made celibacy look not quite so great too, when you were out there in the world and there was so much more opportunity to meet people. Economically too, the Shakers were crippled during the Civil War, and then the Industrial Revolution as it increased. Even though the Shakers loved technology, they just were not able to keep up with the workforce that it required.
You're located in a part of Kentucky where slavery, especially as you went west towards Christian County and Todd County and Logan, was huge. What was the effect of slavery on South Union?
Ooh, it's a complicated subject. The Shakers believing in racial equality. It's not quite as clear cut, and it's definitely not a 2023 description that wouldn't work today. But in those days, they were making major progress towards equality. So if you were a slaveholder, you could join the Shakers, but as soon as you did, you had to free all your slaves. So all of a sudden you have this issue, and at the dinner table, the slaveholder is sitting there with people that were enslaved to him 3 days ago. You think that's an easy transition? It is not. So that was very difficult, especially at South Union, which I think we had a larger African-American population than most of the Shaker villages because of what you have just said, where we are located. So I hate to admit it, but at South Union, they originally segregated the Black Shakers and had what they called the Black family, established in 1807. But they integrated in 1820, which is pretty darn early in our American history, don't you think? So in 1820, they said, this is not working. We need to all be in these dwellings together. And the Shakers not only had freed these folks in the village, they signed manumission papers so they could be free outside of the village too. So they were given the choice to stay or to leave. Some of them left before their manumission papers were signed and were recaptured, unfortunately, and didn't have good ends. Some were able to get away. And I'll say this too, just because you were free within a Shaker village as an African-American person didn't mean that was your choice. You came with your slaveholder. So it might sound good, but you might not want to be a Shaker either. So people did try to leave, and some of them saw great success in the North as business people. Some of them stayed their entire lives at South Union and rose to ranks that women especially would never have in the outside world. And I'm talking about everything from helping with the physician's department to working with the money at the trustee's office, and being teachers and things like that. They were looked on with great esteem in those villages. It's complicated in Kentucky, though.
In recent years, material arts scholarship has concentrated on what pieces were made by enslaved individuals or previously enslaved, and are those identifiable? What about at South Union? You showed us some beautiful furniture.
Yeah.
Are there any pieces that are identified with a specific African-American?
Here's the problem with the Shakers. They were great record keepers, but they did not sign their furniture. And I really wish they had. Occasionally you'll see in a journal that so-and-so made a desk or a table, but we don't know which one that was. There are a few late pieces at Pleasant Hill that have signatures on them, but we're talking the 1870s and the 1880s. But in the early days, very little, if no signed pieces in our collection at all. There are some dated pieces, but no signed pieces. I'd give anything if there were.
I want to emphasize, don't be bashful. If you have a question, come on up here and I'll get out of the way.
Yes, ma'am.
Down there with children and stuff. What is Shaker like down in Pleasant Hill? What is it like today? What does it look like? How do you get your funding? Is it all on what? Can you give us a little?
I'll give you a quick rundown. Yeah.
John, just for the benefit of the people on Zoom, could you, paraphrase or repeat the question?
Ask about what was at South Union and how we sustain ourselves. While Pleasant Hill has many levels, layers, I should say. They have museum, they have crafts, they have overnight accommodations and restaurants. We are primarily just a museum. So the 9 buildings that we have are interpreted with exhibits that talk about Shaker history and exhibit the furniture and things like that. We do a lot of programs and we do a lot of things for children via school type education. We also do a lot of events. Most of our events have come to be food related. People still like Southern food. Do you know that? And so we have found that almost any food event we do sells out. So that's a good situation. We are funded almost, well, a third of our funding comes from our farm. We have 500 acres and that farm is leased out. And thank goodness we bought that property when we did in the 1990s. We had to buy our property in little bitty pieces. We're like a postage stamp. That's how we have built our place back up. But by people that fund us, we write grants all the times to foundations. So that's how we do it. We do not depend on ticket sales or gift shop sales. That's a tiny piece of the pie anymore. So we have to depend on other things. Yes, ma'am. It was a mixed blessing because when it first came in 1860, the Shakers saw it as it's going to change everything. We don't have to go to New Orleans anymore on a flatboat. We can ship right from our own village just about anywhere. It was an amazing opportunity economically for them, but the other half of that was that it did take people away. And the village started to decline seriously after 1860 because so many of those people were leaving. That's the same track that's still there that was driving Henry Bling crazy in 1872 behind the trustees office. And we still hear it. We can see it going through the village today. So a definite mixed blessing. And can I say something too about this young lady that just spoke? Edith Bingham showed up at South Union one summer day with a camera in her hand back about 1989 or 90 and was taking pictures for an article she was writing about the Shakers for the Louisville Magazine. And I just saw her and I happened to go over and talk to her. And it was probably the best thing that ever happened to South Union. Miss Bingham became just a staple at our place. It was her idea to develop a advisory committee. Our board of directors had always been localized, very insular, very small. And she devised this group that had people in Louisville and Nashville and beyond that could influence others to help South Union. So I always tell this to people when I talk about Miss Bingham. She didn't just write a check and say, here's a check and, have a great time. She introduced me to people at the James Graham Brown Foundation in Louisville. We got in a car and went downtown to the Gaines Foundation and to the Crawley Foundation. And she continues to do that today. So that committee was organized about 1990. We have a meeting next month. She is still on that committee. So we owe Edith Bingham a tremendous amount. And a lot of what we are today, we would not be without Miss Bingham. So I'm so glad you're here.
That's a fascinating presentation. I enjoyed the part about furniture and architecture. It's interesting, though, that you could take the opposite approach as well, show the furniture and architecture made by Kentuckians outside the Shaker villages, and they would look almost identical, very, very similar. I was wondering how you, without the documentation, how you can identify South Union furniture, for instance, as opposed to furniture made in the region.
It's a problem. And so we started in the mid 1990s doing research on the very thing you're talking about. We started to study Southern Kentucky furniture and Middle Tennessee furniture, which is very closely related to what we have. And we did 3 different exhibits and different exhibit catalogs that dealt with worldly furniture and South Union furniture and how it all looks so much alike. For instance, the table that you saw that had the elaborately turned legs from South Union, we had one of those that came into the collection about 1962, way before my time. And it was relegated to the back of the storage room because nobody thought it was Shaker. I've been there since 1986 now. And so what happens is, here comes another one. And somebody says, well, we bought this at the auction in 1922. And you look closely, my goodness, the drawers are built exactly alike and the leg turnings are exactly alike. Those 2 tables, very similar. Then here comes another one and another one. And now we have about a dozen of those. So that's how you figure that things are made at South Union. Here's something else too that we've discovered, that whoever it was making furniture was also in charge of building construction because they never had any new ideas. They were using the same old turnings and the same old beating planes on all the stuff. And I can take the foot on that table and take it to a feature on our staircase and show you that exact pear-shaped foot turned upside down to hold the staircase up. They were just doing the same things over and over and over. But I'm sure they thought nobody would ever be studying that all these many years later. So all that to say, it takes looking at stuff over a long period of time. And one piece does not tell the whole story, but 12 definitely tells a different story.
Another question.
All right.
How much land currently does South Union hold, and is it being farmed?
Yes. When we bought the property in 1972, that's when our property was purchased. There were 2 acres and 1 building. Now we have 9 buildings and 500 acres. So yes, that all that land is being farmed. That's what makes our money. Pleasant Hill, on the other hand, I think they have 3,000 acres in part of their property. They've been so fortunate to be able to bring that back. But both villages were comparable in size, 5,000–6,000 acres at the peak in the 19th century. Wish we had it now.
I have 2 questions,
All right.
sir. The first has to do with the restraint of the furniture and the quality and so forth. And I'm interested in the theatricality aspect of the Shakers and wondered what you could tell us about the dancing, the shaking itself, and information about that.
There's some regional things about that too. The Shakers from the very beginning almost used that ritual dance as part of their worship. I'm not sure where the roots of that are, but there's a lot of documentation about it and a lot of people who visited Shaker meeting houses and saw what they were doing. There is no video of it and obviously no photographs of it, although there are some Victorian photographs of a Shaker sister using some of the movement, showing different motions with her hands and what things meant. But we do have great descriptions. I will tell you that in Kentucky, the Shakers thought it got a little out of hand down here too, because a lot of the Shakers here had come out of the Great Revival. So that's what brought them here to begin with, 1805. And if you've ever read anything about the Great Revival, some of the most unusual manifestations of the Spirit, as they would say, took place. And it was just unabashed craziness from an outsider's standpoint. That was happening in the meeting houses at South Union too. And they thought, boy, these Shakers really are dancing down here. They're really getting into it at South Union. So you do see a difference. And so they're being influenced by what happened in the Great Revival. But I'll say this too, the Shakers, and like a lot of us, you know, we become more sophisticated with time and we put things behind us, and they stopped the dance. And in the late 19th century, didn't really do that anymore. And that was all there was to it. There are some aspects of it that they still will demonstrate now, but nothing like it was in the early days.
Thank you. A second question having to do with slavery. I'm not sure I'm right, but I think it was 1823 that the slave ship trade was abolished as illegal in the country. Do you think this fact that they at South Union had former slaves in their community in 1820, I think you said, were they ahead of the country, the Shakers?
Oh, I think they were definitely ahead of the country, because as late as 1862, there are references to human beings being driven through the villages, both South Union and Pleasant Hill. So, yeah, there were still awful things going on in the region outside of Pleasant Hill and South Union. And then after the Civil War, when you think things would calm down, that's when the Ku Klux Klan began to show their heads. And they would come to South Union and nail bills up on the meeting house door and you know, threaten the Shakers. The Shakers at that point were hiring free blacks and paying them a good wage and giving them a place to live. And the Ku Klux Klan did not like that. And before it was over with, ended up burning most of South Union's mills and about 10 of their barns in the 1870s and 1880s. So it was a real difficult time after the war. And that made national news. That made what we would think of as the Associated Press today. You see that article about the Klan in Logan County, all over the United States.
Thank you.
One last question.
Okay.
When I look home, that doesn't exist anymore.
No, that was quite a great thing too. Let me just start by telling you, our museum founder was a woman by the name of Dee Dee Hall, who had remembered the Shakers, and her parents bought a lot of things at the auction. So in the late 50s, she thought, you know, this is being forgotten in Logan County. I think we need to open a museum. So her first task was to open a museum, which she did in a small church in Auburn. By 1962, 2 years later, she had the idea of what they called in those days a pageant. And this pageant was written by one of the professors at Western, and they took original Shaker music and rearranged those songs and had this narrative of South Union history with free license. There's some inaccuracies in it, but it was highly entertaining. And again, made the national news in the 1960s. If you'll remember, there were a lot of outdoor dramas in those days. It was very popular in Kentucky. And this was called Shakertown Revisited. So it was big in the 1960s. It was big in the 1970s. And it was big in the early 80s. And then, like a lot of things, it begins to decline. And I think that people weren't willing to give their entire summers as volunteers anymore by the late 1980s. People had seen it so many times that they stopped coming in those days. So it just declined and it was stopped. We did it for the last time in 1990. So it had a pretty good run, but there's hardly a week goes by that somebody doesn't ask about it when they come by the museum. And it's remembered very fondly in our region.
One more over here.
Were there a lot of other communities like Shakers in the country? Was there not one, maybe, was it Harmony, Indiana? And how was this a real prevalent, and were there a lot of different other communities like Shakers?
In the early part of the 19th century, yes, there were other communal experiments, a lot of those, and some of them more successful than the others, including New Harmony. But the Shakers, I'll have to say, were the most successful of all. You know, we're getting ready to celebrate 250 years in 2024. So that's a pretty big deal. They're small in number, but it's still a remnant. And I think that's pretty important.
Tommy, thank you so much.
Thank you.